Who restored this blueprint? Nathaniel Ashcroft demanded. The question cut across the engineering conference room at 7:45 on a gray November morning. No one in the conference room answered. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table with both hands resting beside a set of blueprints. He looked down at the restored design, then back at the engineers gathered around the table. I flew in from New York 3 days ago because the board warned me this plant might not survive the winter, he said. You people told me this design was impossible to complete. You said the missing calculations could not be recovered and that my brother's work was beyond repair. He lifted the top sheet so everyone could see it. Yet I am holding a restored blueprint. For 3 years, 6 senior engineers and 2 outside consulting firms had tried to complete Daniel Ashcroft's unfinished bridge design. Every simulation had ended the same way. The central span failed under emergency load. The federal review deadline was 30 days away. Without the contract, the Gary plant would close, and 1,800 workers could lose their jobs before Christmas. Nathaniel let the silence stretch. I asked a question. Trevor Pike, the head of the engineering team, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and stepped forward. His face had gone pale, but he still carried the arrogance of a man accustomed to speaking without being challenged. Mr. Ashcroft, Trevor began. His eyes moved briefly toward Richard Cole, the operations director seated near the far corner of the table. Richard gave him no visible signal, but Trevor seemed to be waiting for one. That blueprint had already been rejected. My engineering team left at 9 last night, and none of us touched it after that. But what? Nathaniel asked, his heavy brows drawing together. Trevor swallowed. The design was found on a desk in the archive room. He quickly pointed toward the corner, where a young woman stood beside a rolling cart filled with old project files. That is where Annie works. We assumed someone left it there by mistake, or perhaps she handled it without understanding what it was and marked up the original. Every face in the room turned toward the wall. Annie Brooks stood beside the cart. Her temporary badge hung from a blue cord around her neck. Archive assistant. One of the engineers added, she was here after hours. Another said, nobody from my team authorized her to touch the project. The room settled into a silence that Annie knew well. It was the silence people created when they had already decided who should carry the blame. Nathaniel studied her. Until that moment, he had not known her name. You're Annie Brooks? Richard Cole asked from the corner of the table. His tone was calm, almost courteous. Yet something in it made Annie instinctively tense. What exactly is going on here? Explain yourself. I was only cleaning the desks, Annie whispered. Her voice was so soft, it nearly disappeared beneath the hum of the ventilation system. This blueprint really was restored by... Trevor cut her off before she could finish. There, Mr. Ashcroft. Do you see? He spread his hands dramatically. This girl from the archive room barely finished high school. She doesn't have an engineering degree or any professional training. Your team of highly paid engineers couldn't solve this design, yet she wants everyone to believe she somehow fixed it. She was probably trying to prove she knew something and ended up making a mess of the original. Several younger engineers chuckled. Marcus Reed, the only black mechanical engineer on the team, lowered his head toward the documents in front of him. His grip tightened around his pen, but he remained silent. Nathaniel Ashcroft did not laugh. He slammed the blueprint onto the table hard enough to make several coffee cups shake. A mess? He roared. Are you all blind? This isn't vandalism. He pointed at the fresh blue lines layered over the faded original drawing. The ultimate load calculations have been restored. The entire dynamic joint system, the same one every one of you declared impossible, has been reconstructed with an optimization method that's remarkably accurate. The room fell completely silent. Nathaniel walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Annie. His broad frame cast a shadow over her. I don't know who you are, he said, staring into her eyes. But a young woman your age cannot possibly possess this level of engineering knowledge. Tell me the truth. Who's behind you? Who taught you how to repair this blueprint? His voice softened only slightly. If you tell me the truth, I'll reward you. And I'll reward the person who truly restored this design. Annie slowly lifted her eyes. No one is behind me, Mr. Ashcroft. Trevor laughed loudly. Come on, Gur. Don't claim credit for something you don't understand. These blueprints aren't coloring books. Annie tightened her fingers around the handle of the cart. She had spent 11 months being told when to speak, where to stand, and which conversations did not include her. She released the cart. I restored it. A brief laugh echoed from one side of the room. Trevor leaned back. Annie, this isn't the time. Nathaniel never took his eyes off her. Then prove it. Annie walked to the table. Mr. Pike, she said, turning toward Trevor. The confidence in her voice caught him off guard. When you left last night, you miscalculated the shear force on longitudinal beam number 4. You used the standard formula for conventional carbon steel, but this modular bridge was designed with heat-strengthened alloy steel. If the bridge were built according to your calculations, it would split apart the moment the first fully loaded truck crossed it. The room erupted into whispers. Trevor's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about. Annie stepped closer to Nathaniel and pointed to a tiny embossed symbol near the lower corner of the blueprint. 2 interlocking gears. Mr. Ashcroft, you doubt me because I don't have an engineering degree from a prestigious university, she said calmly. But when I was 8 years old, I wasn't reading fairy tales. My father taught me how to read military structural drawings before I even knew algebra. She paused. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. My father always told me something. Her voice remained soft, yet every person in the room heard each word. Steel never lies. People do, but steel always leaves evidence. The blueprint stretched nearly 6 feet across the table. Its edges had yellowed during 15 years in storage. Daniel Ashcroft's name still appeared in the title block, while faint scrape marks beneath it suggested another name had once existed there. She placed one finger near the center span. The primary load path was altered here. Trevor sighed. That's the reinforcement schedule. I know what it is. You've never studied structural engineering. Annie looked at him. You told me that last month. A few people shifted in their seats. They remembered the incident. Annie had tried to warn Trevor that his team had used the wrong conversion factor during a stress test. He had told her they were discussing engineering and asked her to finish copying the inspection reports. The silence in the conference room turned humiliating. Annie's reminder of the previous month's failure struck Trevor Pike like cold water. His face reddened. That's enough, Annie, Trevor snapped, trying to recover the authority of a department head. One minor conversion mistake during an experimental test does not give you the right to walk in here and lecture people with master's degrees. It wasn't a minor mistake, Mr. Pike, Annie replied. Her calmness seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. You confused pounds per square inch with megapascals. If Marcus hadn't checked the strain gauge after everyone left that night, the test beam could have ruptured inside the lab. Every head turned toward Marcus Reed. The young black mechanical engineer tightened both hands beneath the table. His eyes remained on the papers in front of him, but he did not deny what Annie had said. His silence became its own answer, adding another crack to Trevor's authority. Marcus? Nathaniel asked. His voice was quiet now, which made it sharper. Is that true? Marcus hesitated. He looked at Trevor, whose stare carried a clear warning. Then he looked at Annie, standing alone before the company's senior leadership while everyone waited for her to fail. Marcus drew a slow breath. Yes, Mr. Ashcroft, he said. There was a system-wide discrepancy in the test data last month. Annie pointed out the abnormal reading before we applied the full load. Whispers moved through the conference room. Trevor turned on him. You told me the gauge had drifted. I told you that because you had already dismissed her warning, Marcus said. I recalibrated the equipment and corrected the conversion before the test continued. Nathaniel watched the two men for several seconds. So Annie identified the error before anyone on your team? Marcus nodded. Yes, sir. Richard Cole rose slowly from his chair. His familiar, composed smile remained in place, but whatever warmth it once pretended to carry had vanished from his eyes. Impressive, Richard said as he approached the table. An exceptional memory and unusual powers of observation for someone working in document storage. Annie heard the compliment for what it was. He was praising her attention while denying her knowledge. Richard stopped beside her. But, Mr. Ashcroft, this is not a classroom exercise. We are discussing a federal infrastructure contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars and a bridge system that may one day carry thousands of lives. We cannot place the future of this corporation in the hands of an 18-year-old's instincts or a few engineering tricks passed down at home. I've heard enough. Nathaniel raised a hand, cutting him off. He turned slightly toward Annie. You said your father taught you? Yes. What was his name? Annie did not answer immediately. Richard already knew. She could see it in the care with which he had asked the question. Nathaniel placed his hand over the black notebook. Who was your father? Isaiah Brooks. The name produced no recognition in Nathaniel. but Richard's right thumb pressed hard against the edge of the table. "My father served with the Army Corps of Engineers," Annie continued. "He specialized in temporary bridges, emergency load systems, and structural failure analysis. He worked in this plant before he died." Richard adjusted his glasses. "Many contractors have worked here over the years. He wasn't just a contractor." Annie opened the notebook and turned it so Nathaniel could see the calculations. Along the margins were comments written in blue ink, some marked with the symbol of 2 interlocking gears. "He helped design this bridge." Trevor gave a bitter laugh. "There is no Isaiah Brooks anywhere in the project file." "That doesn't mean he wasn't part of it," Annie said. "It means someone removed him." If Annie's courage to defend her late father touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Richard's smile tightened. "That is a serious accusation." "It's an observation." "Based on what?" Annie pointed to the lower title block. The paper beneath Daniel Ashcroft's name was scraped, not erased with a pencil. The top fibers were removed. There was another credit line there. Nathaniel leaned closer. Under the conference room lights, the damaged strip was visible, a roughened space long enough for another name and title. Annie turned several pages in the notebook. "These dimensions match the original bridge. The joint sequence matches. The emergency load calculations match. Some of the notes in the margins were written by Daniel Ashcroft." Nathaniel stared at the blue handwriting. He recognized the narrow capital letters and the way Daniel crossed the number 7. His brother had written that way since high school. Richard spoke before Nathaniel could respond. "Even if the notebook is authentic, we have no chain of custody. We don't know when these calculations were written or whether they were copied from company records." "My father died 14 years ago," Annie said. "The bridge files were sealed 15 years ago. And yet you brought the notebook into this building. I carry it every day." "Convenient." Nathaniel looked up. "Enough, Richard." The operations director stepped back, though his expression did not change. Nathaniel looked at Trevor. "Run her corrections through the full system, every load condition, no shortcuts." "Mr. Ashcroft, you cannot seriously trust this girl so easily," Trevor protested. "What if she's wrong?" Nathaniel turned his cold gaze on him. "If she is wrong, I will fire her," he said. "And I will fire you too, Trevor, for allowing an unlicensed 18-year-old to identify a fundamental error in your calculations." Trevor's mouth opened, but no words came. "That was not a suggestion," Nathaniel said. The engineers collected their laptops and moved toward the simulation room. Marcus followed last, pausing long enough to meet Annie's eyes. Richard passed behind her, close enough that only she could hear him. "You should be careful with old records," he said. "People often misunderstand what they find." Annie looked at the interlocking gears on the blueprint. "My father taught me to check twice." Richard's expression stayed calm, but he did not answer. The full simulation began at 8:23. Nathaniel stood behind the glass wall of the control room, while Trevor entered Annie's corrections into the main engineering system. 3 monitors displayed the bridge from different angles. Blue lines marked the primary supports. Yellow lines showed the distribution of weight across the modular joints. Annie remained near the door with her father's notebook held against her chest. Richard stood beside Nathaniel, his hands folded behind his back. Marcus occupied the terminal next to Trevor and checked each value before allowing the program to proceed. "Flood load first," Nathaniel said. Trevor clicked the command. On the center screen, dark water rose around the virtual bridge. Pressure increased against the support columns. The joints moved within their permitted range, but the span remained stable. Trevor said nothing. "Emergency vehicle load," Nathaniel ordered. A line of military transport trucks appeared on the model. Weight increased across the bridge until the system reached the limit that had caused every previous simulation to fail. The warning indicator changed from green to yellow. Trevor leaned closer to the screen. The bridge held. Marcus released a breath through his nose. Nathaniel looked at the results, then at Annie. Temperature cycle. Trevor entered the command. The simulated temperature fell below 0, rose above 100 degrees, then dropped again. The steel expanded and contracted. The restored joints adjusted without forcing the load into the secondary connections. The final status appeared on the screen. Test completed. Structural failure. None. No one spoke for several seconds. Trevor removed his hands from the keyboard. The model still needs physical verification. Of course it does, Nathaniel said. That is what engineers do after a successful simulation. Trevor's jaw tightened. Richard stepped closer to the screen. One successful run does not establish authorship. The girl may have copied the values from somewhere. Annie looked at him. From where? That is what we need to determine. Nathaniel turned away from the monitors. How much would these corrections have cost if we had hired another consulting firm? Trevor hesitated. A complete structural review could run several $100,000. Nathaniel looked at Annie. Then you should be compensated. I don't want a reward. The answer surprised him more than the simulation had. You worked through the night and solved a problem that has stalled this company for 3 years. I know. Then why refuse? Annie placed the black notebook on the nearest table. Because I didn't fix it for money. Nathaniel studied her. What did you fix it for? She looked through the glass at the blueprint still spread across the conference room table. Because somebody erased my father. The words changed Nathaniel's expression. He glanced toward Richard, then back to Annie. You said Isaiah Brooks helped design the bridge. If that is true, we will investigate it. If I have a notebook and an altered title block, I need records. My father had records. Where are they? He died before he could give them to anyone who would listen. Richard stepped forward. Mr. Ashcroft, we should avoid making promises before legal reviews the material. If Mr. Brooks worked as a contractor, the company may have owned anything he produced. Annie faced him. Owning the paper does not mean you created what was written on it. Richard's smile returned. That is a legal distinction, not an emotional one. Nathaniel raised a hand before Annie could respond. Enough. He turned to her. I can arrange a scholarship. Purdue, Notre Dame, any engineering school willing to review your work. I'm not asking you to send me away to school so this company can forget what happened here. That is not what I said. It is what companies do. They offer one person an opportunity and call the problem solved. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, but he did not become angry. What do you want, Miss Brooks? It was the first time he had addressed her by her last name. I want my father's name found in the records. I want to know who removed it, and I want to know why he died in this factory. The control room became still. Richard spoke carefully. Isaiah Brooks died in an industrial accident. Annie looked at him. You remembered his name quickly. Richard's face did not move. Nathaniel turned toward him. You knew her father? I knew of the incident. I was responsible for operations records at the time. Then why didn't you recognize the name in the conference room? It happened 14 years ago. I needed a moment. Annie noticed Marcus watching Richard. He had noticed the same thing she had. Nathaniel took his phone from his pocket and called his assistant. I want every personnel, contractor, safety, and legal record connected to Isaiah Brooks brought to my office. Nothing is to be removed or copied without my approval. He ended the call. Richard adjusted his cuff. Some archived safety files were transferred off-site years ago. Then bring them back. That may take time. You have until noon. Richard's smile disappeared. When the meeting ended, Annie returned the notebook to her bag and pushed her cart toward the archive room. She had reached the vending machines when an older man in a faded Union jacket stepped away from the wall. He was broad through the shoulders, though age had bent him slightly. His gray hair was cut short, and he leaned on a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. Miss Brooks, he said. Annie stopped. Few people in the factory called her that. Yes, my name is Walter Hayes. I worked with your father. She tightened her grip on the cart. You knew him? Walter nodded. Better than I deserved to. Annie waited. He looked toward the hallway to make sure they were alone. Isaiah and Daniel Ashcroft worked on that bridge together. Your father designed most of the emergency joint system. Daniel was trying to get his name added to the official project. Trying? The board did not want it. Why? Walter's eyes lowered. Some of them said a contract engineer should not share credit with an Ashcroft. Others had a different word for what they meant. Annie understood. Walter reached into his jacket and removed a small brass key. Your father gave me this 2 days before he died. She did not take it. Why are you giving it to me now? Because I should have given it to you years ago. What does it open? A maintenance locker in Building C number 117. What is inside? I don't know. Isaiah told me that if anything happened to him, I was supposed to give the key to Daniel. But Daniel died. 1 year later. Annie looked at the key in Walter's palm. And you kept it for 14 years. Walter's face tightened. Richard threatened to close the plant if anyone challenged the accident report. My wife was receiving cancer treatment through the company insurance. Hundreds of families depended on this place. My father had a family. I know. No, you knew then. Walter accepted the words without defending himself. We told ourselves silence was protecting people, he said. Most of the time, it was only protecting our fear. Annie took the key. When she returned to the archive room, the door was locked as she had left it. She entered, turned on the light, and pushed her cart toward the desk. The top drawer stood open. Annie had locked it before the meeting. Nothing appeared to be missing. The folders remained in place, and the spare keys were still inside. Then she saw the black notebook on the desk. She had put it in her bag. Now it lay 2 inches from the edge, its cracked cover facing upward. Someone had searched her things while she was gone. Annie reached for the notebook, then stopped. 3 diagonal scratches and a single dot had been cut into the dust beside it. The same warning symbol her father had used on the blueprint. But these marks were fresh. Annie did not touch the notebook. She stepped backward and examined the room. The door showed no damage. The lock had not been forced, and the narrow window beside it remained closed. Whoever entered had used a key. The fresh symbol in the dust bothered her more than the open drawer. Her father had used 3 slashes and a dot as a warning to check a figure that looked correct. Someone else now knew that mark and wanted her to understand that they knew. She took a photograph with her phone, slipped the notebook into her backpack, and closed the drawer without disturbing anything else. At 11:15, Nathaniel summoned her to his office. Richard Cole was already there, standing near the windows while Nathaniel reviewed a stack of personnel files. "We found your father's contractor record," Nathaniel said. "Structural systems consultant, Army Corps background, employed here for 22 months. Was he assigned to Daniel's project?" "The file does not say." "It should." Nathaniel looked toward Richard. "Half the attachments are missing." Richard remained composed. Records from that period were transferred during the digital conversion. Some files were damaged. Personnel, safety, and project records all damaged at the same time. Old companies have old problems. Annie placed her phone on the desk and showed them the photograph. "Someone opened my locked drawer while we were in the simulation room." Richard leaned closer. "Nothing was taken?" "My notebook was removed from my bag and left on the desk." Nathaniel looked at her backpack. "You are certain you had it with you?" "I carried it into the control room." Richard studied the scratched symbol. "It could be cleaning marks. It was cut into the dust. Then perhaps someone is trying to frighten you." "That is what she just said," Nathaniel replied. Richard's expression tightened. "I am suggesting we should not confuse workplace misconduct with a conspiracy." Nathaniel called security and ordered the archive hallway footage preserved. The answer came back 10 minutes later. The camera had gone offline during the simulation. Richard blamed aging equipment. Annie said nothing. She was beginning to understand that Richard always had an ordinary explanation ready before anyone finished asking the question. After lunch, Walter met her near Building C. Marcus joined them carrying a maintenance tablet and a flashlight. Nathaniel had assigned him to accompany Annie while they checked locker 117. Officially, they were conducting an inventory. Unofficially, Nathaniel no longer wanted her moving through the older parts of the factory alone. Building C had been partially abandoned after production shifted east. The air smelled of metal dust and machine oil. Yellow safety lines faded across the concrete floor, and old cranes hung from ceiling rails above rows of unused equipment. Walter stopped at the entrance. "My knee won't take those stairs," he said. He handed Annie a second flashlight. "The lockers are on the upper maintenance level." "You waited 14 years, Annie said. "You can wait another 10 minutes. Walter accepted the rebuke. "Fair enough." Marcus followed Annie up the steel staircase. For several steps, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "I should have backed you up sooner." "You mean today or last month?" "Both." Annie kept climbing. "I wasn't the one who made the conversion error," he continued. "You were the one who knew." Marcus looked toward the floor below. "Trevor decides who gets assigned to major projects. I spent 4 years trying to get into that department. So you let him blame me?" "Yes." His honesty stopped her. Marcus did not ask to be forgiven. "I told myself staying quiet was different from joining in. It wasn't." They reached the maintenance level. Locker 117 stood at the end of a narrow row, its green paint chipped around the handle. The brass key turned with resistance. Inside, they found a photograph. a cassette tape, folded load charts, and a sealed envelope with Nathaniel Ashcroft's name written across the front. Annie picked up the photograph. Isaiah stood beside Daniel Ashcroft in front of a small bridge model. Her father looked younger than she remembered him. Wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, Daniel had one hand resting on the model. Both men were smiling. On the back, Isaiah had written, "First full joint test. Daniel says it will hold. I say check it twice." Annie's throat tightened. Marcus unfolded one of the charts. "These are the original emergency load calculations." A motor started above them. The sound was low at first, then rose into a strained metallic whine. Marcus looked up. That crane shouldn't be powered. A suspended steel beam began moving along the ceiling rail. No operator stood at the control station. Annie heard a sharp clicking beneath the motor's strain. The trolley was drifting outside the marked track, carrying the beam toward them. "Move," she said. Marcus stared upward. The brake should stop it. It won't. Annie saw the cable twist. Her father had once taught her that a loaded line rarely failed without warning. It tightened, jumped, then went still. She grabbed Marcus's jacket and pulled him backward. The cable snapped. The beam dropped through the maintenance platform where Marcus had been standing. Steel grating folded beneath the impact. Annie fell against the railing, her right wrist bending under her weight. Pain shot into her arm. Marcus dragged her away as the beam swung once and struck the lockers. Number 117 crushed inward. But Annie still held the photograph and envelope against her chest. Walter shouted from below, "Are you two all right?" Marcus looked at Annie's wrist. "We need medical. Check the control panel first." "Annie, before someone changes it." They descended by the rear stairs. Marcus opened the crane panel with his maintenance key. The emergency cutoff had been bypassed with a short length of copper wire. Fresh tool marks scored the screws. Nathaniel arrived with Richard and 2 security officers 15 minutes later. Richard examined the damage. "Old equipment fails." Marcus held up the copper wire. "Old equipment doesn't bypass its own safety circuit." Trevor appeared behind them. "Who authorized her to open that locker?" Nathaniel ignored him and looked at Annie. "Can you move your fingers?" "Yes." "Then you are still going to the clinic." "I need to know what is in the envelope." "You nearly died." "So did Marcus." Nathaniel glanced at the ruined platform, then at the bypassed control panel. "This was deliberate," he said. Richard folded his arms. "We do not know that yet." Nathaniel turned on him. "A camera fails, a locked drawer is opened, and now a crane safety system is disabled. How many coincidences do you require?" No one answered. At the clinic, a nurse wrapped Annie's sprained wrist while a paper Thanksgiving turkey hung crookedly above the reception desk. Marcus sat beside her, his forearms resting on his knees. "I'm sorry," he said. Annie looked at him. "You already said that. I mean for laughing when Trevor did. You didn't have to insult me to help them." Marcus lowered his eyes. "You only had to stay quiet," she said. Nathaniel entered carrying the recovered envelope. "I want you on the restoration team," he said. Annie shook her head. "I'll provide security." "No." "A salary. A real one." "No." Walter appeared in the doorway. "If you leave, Richard controls the record again." Annie looked at the envelope, then at her father's photograph. She took a slow breath. "I have 3 conditions," she said. "My father's role is investigated. Every contribution is recorded under the correct name, and no worker's safety gets buried to protect this company." Nathaniel held her gaze. "Agreed." The next morning, Annie entered the engineering department wearing a new badge. Junior Design Apprentice, Historical Engineering Consultant. Trevor read it and gave a short laugh. "A title doesn't make you qualified." Annie stopped beside him. "Neither does a corner office." Across the building, Richard closed his office door and made a call. "The girl is inside the project now." The following Monday, Annie walked into the engineering department for the first time as part of the restoration team. The new badge clipped to her shirt attracted more attention than she did. Some engineers glanced at it, then quickly looked away. Others stared long enough to make sure she noticed. Her assigned desk stood beside the copy room, separated from the main engineering bullpen by a row of filing cabinets. It was technically inside the department but far enough away that conversations stopped before reaching her. Trevor dropped a stack of maintenance reports onto her desk. "Start organizing these." Annie looked at the reports. "These belong to administration. They belong wherever I say they belong. Before she could answer, Nathaniel entered the department. Morning, he said. Every engineer looked up. Nathaniel stopped beside Annie's desk. Why is Miss Brooks sitting over here? Trevor answered immediately. She's still learning. I thought it would be less distracting. Nathaniel glanced across the room. 4 empty workstations sat inside the engineering area. She works with the restoration team. Yes, sir. Then she sits with the restoration team. Trevor forced a smile. Of course. 10 minutes later, Annie was moved to an empty workstation between Marcus and a senior structural engineer named Linda Foster, a woman in her late 50s who had spent 30 years designing highway bridges throughout the Midwest. Linda offered Annie a cup of coffee. I've heard you've already caused enough trouble around here, she said with a faint smile. Annie wasn't sure whether it was a joke. Linda slid the coffee toward her. So have I. For the first time that morning, Annie smiled back. The team's first assignment was to review every section of Daniel's bridge before preparing a full-scale prototype. Nathaniel stood beside the projection screen. I don't want assumptions, he said. Every number gets verified. If someone disagrees with a calculation, explain why. Don't tell me who has the most experience. Show me the evidence. Several engineers nodded. Trevor remained silent. The meeting began. Linda presented the revised foundation design. Marcus reviewed the vibration analysis. Trevor summarized the reinforcement schedule. When Annie noticed a discrepancy in one of the expansion joints, she raised her hand slightly. The thermal allowance doesn't match the steel grade. Trevor continued talking as though she had never spoken. Marcus glanced toward her but remained quiet. 2 minutes later, Linda frowned at the same drawing. Wait, she interrupted. The thermal allowance is wrong. Trevor stopped. Nathaniel looked at him. Who identified it first? No one answered. Linda looked toward Annie. She did. Nathaniel turned to Trevor. Correct it. Trevor changed the figure without comment. The meeting continued. Half an hour later, Annie spoke again. The vibration model assumes uniform wind loading. Trevor sighed loudly. We've always used that model. But this bridge crosses open floodplain, Annie replied. Crosswinds won't remain uniform. Trevor rolled his eyes. Marcus examined the simulation. She may be right. Linda leaned closer to the screen. She is. Nathaniel folded his arms. Run both models. 20 minutes later, the revised simulation produced a safer design. Nathaniel looked around the room. From now on, every objection is answered with evidence. His eyes settled briefly on Trevor. Not rank. The room grew noticeably quieter. At lunch, Annie carried her tray into the cafeteria. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and weak coffee filled most of the workers' trays. Older welders argued about football while 2 electricians debated whether the factory would still be open by Christmas. Annie sat alone until Earl Simmons, a welder with nearly 40 years at Ashcroft, stopped beside her table. You're Isaiah's girl, aren't you? She looked up. Yes, sir. Earl nodded once. Your daddy explained steel so ordinary folks like me could understand it. He pulled out the chair across from her. You do the same. He didn't stay long. He simply finished his coffee, wished her luck, and returned to work. Across the cafeteria, Trevor watched the conversation with visible irritation. That afternoon, the team compared Daniel's handwritten calculations with the company's digital archive. Annie noticed another inconsistency. These material specifications don't match. Trevor barely looked up. They're identical. No. She enlarged the scanned drawing. The printed specification says ASTM, a 709 grade 50. And the digital archive says grade 36. Marcus leaned toward the monitor. She isn't talking about strength. Annie nodded. The older steel expands differently under prolonged temperature cycling. Linda checked the original document. The archive was altered. Nathaniel walked over. Can anyone explain why? No one could. Trevor muttered. Probably a scanning mistake. Annie shook her head. A scanner can't replace one material specification with another. Nathaniel stared at the document for several seconds. Every archived engineering file connected to Daniel's project gets audited. Richard Cole entered the room just in time to hear the order. That could take weeks. Then it takes weeks. Richard smiled politely. Investors won't appreciate another delay. Nathaniel looked directly at him. I care more about whether the bridge stands than whether investors become impatient. Richard said nothing else. Late that afternoon, Annie returned to the archive room to compare another set of drawings. She logged into the archive server and searched the access history. 3 original bridge files had been opened at 2:13 that morning. She frowned. Nobody on the restoration team had been working overnight. She opened the system log. The files had been accessed using an administrator account assigned to Richard Cole's office. Before she could print the record, the screen refreshed. Access history not available. She checked again. The entry had disappeared. Fortunately, the printer beside her desk had already begun feeding out the first page. Annie pulled the warm sheet from the tray just as the system deleted the remaining record. She folded the page and slipped it inside Isaiah's notebook. Someone inside the company had started erasing evidence again. This time, Annie had managed to save part of it before it vanished. Annie waited until the archive room door closed behind her before unfolding the printed access log. The page showed only one surviving line. Golong Duen 3 times AM. Administrator access. Source, Operations Office. Richard Cole's name did not appear, but the account number matched the one assigned to his department. Annie checked it twice against the system directory, then photographed the page and sent the image to Marcus. "Do not mention this on company email," she typed. His reply came less than a minute later. "Where are you?" "Archive room." "Stay there." Annie almost laughed. The words sounded protective, but Marcus was 2 buildings away and she had already learned how little a locked door meant inside Ashcroft. She folded the page into Isaiah's notebook and slipped it beneath her sweater. When Marcus arrived, he checked the hallway before entering. "You printed this before the log disappeared?" "The first page. The rest was deleted." Marcus studied the timestamp. Richard's office has 3 administrator accounts. His assistant's, and a maintenance account. Who can delete the history? Richard, information security. Maybe 2 people in corporate. Trevor? Not directly. Annie looked toward the ceiling camera. Its red indicator was on, but that no longer reassured her. Marcus lowered his voice. "We need a copy outside the plant. I already took a picture. Send it to someone you trust." The answer came too quickly. "There isn't anyone." Marcus glanced at her. "Walter?" Annie thought about the brass key he had kept for 14 years. Walter had failed her father once, but he had also stepped forward when silence became harder to live with. "I'll bring it to him." They agreed not to confront Richard until they understood what files had been accessed. Marcus would review the project database from a separate engineering terminal. Annie would compare the deleted records against Isaiah's documents. On Sunday afternoon, she took the city bus to Walter Hayes' neighborhood on the west side of Gary. The wind off Lake Michigan had stripped most of the leaves from the trees, and inflatable Thanksgiving turkeys leaned sideways in several yards. Walter's house was a small brick bungalow with a faded Union sticker in the front window. Before Annie could knock twice, a woman in her 70s opened the door. "You must be Isaiah's girl." Annie nodded. "Annie Brooks. I'm June Hayes, Walter's sister. Come inside before the cold follows you." The living room smelled of pot roast, onions, and coffee. An old Motown station played from a radio on the kitchen counter. A folded American flag sat in a wooden case above the fireplace beside photographs of factory picnics, military graduations, and men in hard hats. Walter rose from a worn recliner and reached for his cane. "You came. You said my father left more than a key." June pointed toward the dining table. "Hard things can wait until after people eat. I'm not hungry. That's what worried people always say." Annie sat. June served pot roast, carrots, mashed potatoes, and cornbread. She did not ask invasive questions. She spoke about the weather, the factory's old Thanksgiving food drives, and how Isaiah once repaired her porch steps without accepting payment. "He said the angle was wrong," June recalled. "Your father could not look at a crooked support without fixing it." After the dishes were cleared, Walter brought out the half-burned safety report from locker 117. He had placed each fragile page inside a clear plastic sleeve. "Isaiah was investigating a steel shipment," he said. "The certificates listed 1 grade. The material delivered was cheaper." Annie compared the shipment codes to the list in her father's notebook. "They used it in a federal project." Walter nodded. "Military storage structures and 2 temporary bridges. Were the bridges built? One was replaced before it opened, the other passed inspection. Because my father corrected it? That was my understanding." Walter showed her a copy of a procurement form. Richard Cole's signature appeared at the bottom. "He approved the material substitution," Annie said. "He approved the purchase. Whether he ordered the false certification is what Isaiah was trying to prove. Annie removed the access log from her notebook. This account opened Daniel's files at 2:13 Friday morning. The record was deleted while I was looking at it. Walter studied the page. Operations office. Richard's department. June, who had been pouring coffee, stopped beside the table. Then you take that paper out of this house tonight. Walter looked at her. She set down the pot. I lived through the first time people came asking questions. I know what fear looks like when it wears a company badge. Annie looked between them. What happened after my father reported the steal? Walter's hand remained on the plastic sleeve. He never filed the final report. Why? He died the morning he was supposed to meet a federal inspector. The room became quiet except for the radio. Annie asked, who knew about the meeting? Daniel, me, Richard. Anyone else? Maybe the union attorney. Then why did you sign the accident report? Walter did not look away. Richard told us the plant would close if the investigation went public. He said the federal contracts would be frozen and the insurance company would walk. My wife was in chemotherapy. Hundreds of families depended on the medical plan. My father had a family too. I know. You knew then. Walter's face tightened. Yes. He did not explain further. That made the confession heavier. We told ourselves we were protecting the workers, he said. Truth is, we were protecting our own fear. Annie looked at the report, the signature, and the date of Isaiah's death. Justice is supposed to be blind, Walter continued. Too often, it's only blind to the people without money. Annie placed her hand over the notebook. Then help me make it look. Walter nodded. Before she left, he gave her a flash drive containing scanned union records and an old contact list from Isaiah's final year at the plant. June wrapped 2 slices of cornbread in foil and pushed them into Annie's bag. Evidence is not dinner, she said. By the time Annie reached her apartment, darkness had settled over Gary. The hallway light outside her unit was broken. She unlocked the door and immediately knew someone had been inside. Nothing obvious was missing. The television remained on its stand. Her father's Army Corps mug sat in the cabinet. The envelope of rent money was still beneath the flour container, but the photocopies of the safety report were gone. Annie moved toward the kitchen table. Isaiah's steel ruler lay across the center of it. She had carried that ruler to the plant that morning and left it inside her locked desk. Someone had taken it, entered her apartment, and placed it there. Her phone rang. Marcus. Annie, don't go home. She stared at the ruler. I'm already here. Get out. Richard's office accessed your personnel file. Your address was opened at 4:12 this afternoon. A floorboard creaked in the bedroom. Annie stopped breathing. Marcus heard the silence. What is it? She backed toward the door. I don't think I'm alone. Annie backed toward the door without taking her eyes off the dark bedroom. Marcus, she whispered, call the police. I already am. Get into the hallway. Another creak came from inside the room. Then the window frame shifted. Annie pulled the apartment door open and stepped into the corridor. She ran toward the stairwell just as something struck the bedroom floor behind her. By the time she reached the first floor landing, Marcus was still on the phone, speaking to both her and the dispatcher. Stay where people can see you, he said. Don't go back upstairs. The building manager, Mrs. Donnelly, opened her door in a robe and slippers. She was 63, carried a wooden rolling pin, and did not ask permission before pulling Annie inside. You sit at that table, she said. Nobody walks into this building and frightens one of my tenants. Police arrived 9 minutes later. They found the bedroom window open and muddy marks on the fire escape, but no one inside. The intruder had searched Annie's desk and emptied a box containing Isaiah's old photographs. Nothing valuable had been taken. The message was clear. Whoever entered had not come to steal. They had come to show Annie that locked doors could be opened. Marcus arrived with Nathaniel 20 minutes later. Nathaniel wore no overcoat, only a dark sweater over his dress shirt. He had left a board dinner before the main course and driven from downtown Gary himself. Are you hurt? He asked. No. Pack a bag. Annie frowned. Why? You're not staying here tonight. I can decide where I stay. Nathaniel looked toward the police officer photographing the window. Someone accessed your company file, broke into your home, and left an object from your locked desk on the table. That still doesn't mean you decide for me. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to protect you. Then ask. The correction stopped him. Marcus watched from the hallway but did not interfere. Nathaniel took a breath. Would you agree to stay somewhere secure until we know who did this? Annie looked at Mrs. Donnelly, who stood behind him with the rolling pin still in one hand. You can stay with me, the older woman said. My sofa pulls out, and I make better coffee than any hotel. Annie nodded. I'll stay here. Nathaniel did not like the decision, but he accepted it. Before leaving, he ordered company security to preserve every record connected to the access of Annie's personnel file. He also arranged for an off-duty police officer to remain outside the building. By morning, the story had leaked. A local television station reported that an 18-year-old archive assistant had restored Daniel Ashcroft's unfinished bridge design. The report included a photograph of Annie entering the factory, her injured wrist wrapped beneath her coat. By noon, national websites had repeated the story. Some called her a prodigy. Others questioned whether Ashcroft Industries had staged the discovery to distract from the plant's financial crisis. One headline referred to her as the Blueprint Girl. Another asked whether a teenager with no degree should be allowed near public infrastructure. Annie read 3 articles before closing her phone. They didn't listen when I was invisible, she told Marcus in the cafeteria. Now they're listening to a version of me they invented. Marcus set down his coffee. You could make a statement. And say what? The truth. Which part? That someone broke into my apartment? That my father's name was removed? That half the people upstairs still think I copied the calculations? Marcus had no answer. Across the cafeteria, older workers watched Annie with open curiosity. Earl Simmons approached carrying a tray of chili and cornbread. My wife saw you on the news, he said. Annie braced herself. She said you looked too thin and told me to make sure you ate. He placed the cornbread on her tray. You don't have to do that. I know. Earl lowered his voice. Folks around here remember your father, more than management thinks. What do they remember? That he listened before he spoke. That he could explain a load failure without making a welder feel stupid. That he was asking questions before he died. Annie looked at him. Would they say that publicly? Earl considered it. Some will. Some are still afraid. Nathaniel called a meeting that afternoon. Cameras had gathered outside the front gate, and the board wanted Annie removed from public view until the attention faded. Nathaniel presented the decision as protection. You'll work from a secure office, he said. No press contact. No public appearances until legal clears it. Annie folded her arms. Did I agree to that? This is temporary. You keep using that word when you mean you've already decided. Richard Cole sat near the end of the table, observing. Nathaniel lowered his voice. There are threats. Then deal with the threats. Don't hide me. I'm responsible for your safety. You're responsible for the workplace. You're not responsible for choosing when I'm allowed to speak. The room stayed quiet. Nathaniel looked toward the window, then back at her. What do you want? To decide for myself. It was the second time in 2 days that Annie had forced him to understand the difference between helping someone and controlling them. He nodded. All right. No statements without coordination, but no restrictions without your agreement. Richard adjusted his glasses. That exposes the company to unnecessary risk. Nathaniel looked at him. She is not company property. The next morning, Marcus asked to speak during the union briefing. Nearly 200 workers had gathered in the fabrication hall to hear whether the restored bridge could save the plant. Marcus stood behind a portable microphone. I need to correct something, he said. Annie Brooks did not stumble onto a solution. She identified errors our engineering team missed. She also saved my life when the crane system failed. Trevor stood near the rear wall, his arms crossed. Marcus continued. I laughed when people mocked her. I stayed quiet because I thought protecting my position meant I belonged here. I was wrong. A few workers shifted uncomfortably. Earl called from the front row. That girl didn't ask us to call her a genius. She asked us to check the numbers. This time, the applause began among the welders. It spread through the room. Annie stood beside the stage, uncertain what to do with it. Public approval felt no safer than public ridicule. Both could disappear as soon as she disappointed people. That evening, Nathaniel brought her a structural problem unrelated to Daniel's design. No notes, he said. No old files. Just this. It concerned a temporary span exposed to uneven flood debris. Annie studied it for nearly an hour, filled 2 pages with calculations, then changed her first answer after noticing an unstable lateral force. Nathaniel reviewed her work. That one was yours, he said. The recognition was quiet. It mattered more because no one else heard it. Over the next 3 days, the team prepared a scaled bridge model for a public demonstration. Federal transportation officials, union leaders, investors, and reporters would attend. A successful test could keep the contract alive. Annie checked every joint herself. Late on the final night, she left the testing hall after 11. Her phone vibrated as she crossed the empty parking lot. The number was blocked. She answered but heard only static. Then a distorted voice said, "Your father should have left the numbers alone." The call ended. Annie stood beneath the parking lot light, looking toward the dark factory windows. Behind one of them, someone was still watching. The demonstration began at 10 o'clock the next morning inside the main fabrication hall. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform where the scaled bridge model stretched across 2 reinforced supports. American flags hung beside Ashcroft banners. Reporters crowded near the front. Federal transportation officials sat with clipboards on their knees, while factory workers filled the rear rows with their spouses and children. Annie stood behind the stage in a navy blazer June Hayes had loaned her. The sleeves were slightly too long. She had checked every joint twice before sunrise and once more after the technicians arrived. Marcus approached with 2 cups of coffee. "You should drink something." "I'm fine. You said that yesterday, then forgot lunch." Annie took the cup. Across the hall, Trevor moved between the control stations with a headset around his neck. He had spoken to Annie only when necessary during the final preparations. Richard Cole stood beside 3 members of the board, smiling for the cameras as though he had supported the project from the beginning. Nathaniel stepped to the microphone. Furnace fans and low conversation filled the hall until he raised one hand. "This plant has spent 3 years trying to recover a design my brother left unfinished," he said. "During that time, we relied on titles, resumes, and expensive outside opinions. We overlooked the person who understood the problem because she was young, because she worked in the archive room, and because none of us expected the answer to come from her." He looked toward Annie. "This project exists today because Annie Brooks saw what the rest of us refused to see." The first applause came from the welders. Earl Simmons stood and clapped above his head. Other workers joined him. Marcus smiled, but Annie remained still. Nathaniel gestured for her to come forward. Annie walked onto the platform and faced the crowd. Bright television lights made it difficult to see individual faces. She could make out Walter and June in the second row. Mrs. Donnelly sat beside them wearing her best coat. Linda Foster stood near the control station with a reassuring nod. Annie adjusted the microphone. "This bridge was not designed by one person," she said. "Daniel Ashcroft worked with my father, Isaiah Brooks. Their purpose was simple. They wanted a bridge that could be transported quickly and assembled where storms, floods, or war had cut communities off from hospitals, schools, and each other." A reporter raised a hand, but Nathaniel motioned for him to wait. Annie continued, "My father used to say a structure tells the truth about every force placed on it. Today, the numbers will tell us whether we did the work correctly." She stepped away from the microphone. Trevor activated the first test. Hydraulic presses lowered onto the model, applying a controlled static load. The digital display climbed steadily. 20%, 40, 60. The joints flexed within their expected limits. At 100%, the bridge remained level. Applause moved through the hall. "Flood, force simulation," Linda announced. Water pressure was represented through lateral hydraulic arms pushing against the support system. The bridge shifted less than 2 millimeters. Marcus checked the monitor. "Within tolerance." Nathaniel glanced at Annie. She nodded. The vibration test came next. Motors beneath the platform simulated repeated vehicle movement. The bridge hummed but held. Workers began smiling. One man lifted his small son so the boy could see above the crowd. A federal official leaned toward his colleague and said something while pointing at the data screen. For the first time in years, the factory sounded hopeful. Trevor removed his headset. "Final dynamic, load test," he announced. Annie looked toward the primary control terminal. A warning icon flickered in the corner of the display, then vanished. She stepped closer. "Marcus, did you see that?" "See what?" "The joint 4 tolerance window." Trevor turned. "The system is ready. Hold the test." Reporters immediately began whispering. Trevor frowned. "We've checked the sequence. I saw a value change. You saw a screen refresh." Annie moved toward the terminal. "Open the joint table." Richard spoke from beside the board members. "We have federal officials waiting, Miss Brooks. Is there a technical reason to delay?" I need 30 seconds. Nathaniel looked at Trevor. Open it. Trevor entered a command. The table appeared. All values looked correct. Annie scanned the fourth line. Scroll right. Trevor did. Nothing appeared wrong. He looked at Nathaniel. The system is clean. Nathaniel turned to Annie. She felt every person in the hall watching her. Proceed, she said, though the unease remained. Trevor activated the test. A loaded carriage began moving across the bridge model. Its weight represented a convoy of emergency vehicles. The first modular joint compressed and released. The second held. The third passed beneath the carriage. As the load reached the center, Annie heard a sharp metallic pop. Stop the test. Trevor reached for the control. The fourth joint exploded. A steel connector tore free and shot across the platform. Marcus shoved a technician out of its path. The fragment struck his shoulder and spun him to the floor. The bridge model folded at the center. People screamed. Nathaniel pulled Annie backward as a secondary support crashed across the edge of the stage. Workers rushed toward Marcus while security ordered the crowd to move away. Kill the hydraulics, Linda shouted. Trevor hit the emergency control. The motor stopped. Annie dropped beside Marcus. Blood spread through his shirt near the shoulder, but he was conscious. Don't move, she said. I can feel my fingers. That's good. Paramedics entered from the side doors. They cut away Marcus's sleeve and secured his arm before lifting him onto a stretcher. As they carried him out, Richard moved toward the control station. What happened? Trevor stared at the screen. The load tolerance changed. When? 19 minutes before the test. Annie stood. That's impossible. Trevor opened the system log. A line appeared beneath the Joint 4 file. User, A. Brooks. Value modified. 9:40, 1 a.m. The room's attention shifted toward Annie. She shook her head. I didn't touch that terminal. Trevor's voice rose. The system says you did. My account was locked after final verification. Richard looked toward Nathaniel. We have a serious security breach. A reporter near the stage called out, Miss Brooks, did you alter the design? Another shouted. Was this retaliation against the company? Security stepped between Annie and the cameras. Nathaniel examined the log. His face remained controlled, but Annie saw the doubt gathering around him, not belief that she was guilty, but fear of what the board, insurers, and federal officials would do next. Richard lowered his voice. She must be removed from the project immediately. Nathaniel looked at Annie. Your access is suspended until we determine how this happened. You believe that? I said suspended, not terminated. You saw me check every joint. I also have a federal official asking why your name is on the alteration. My name was put there. I need time. Annie looked at the collapsed bridge, then toward the doors through which Marcus had been carried. You believed me when I saved your company, she said. The moment saving me became difficult. You believed the computer. That isn't fair. No, it isn't. She removed her badge and placed it in his hand. Outside the hall, reporters followed as security escorted her toward the employee exit. Questions struck from every direction. Did you lie about your training? Did your father really work on the design? Were you trying to embarrass Ashcroft Industries? Annie did not answer. At the hospital, Marcus woke with his shoulder bandaged and Trevor standing beside the bed. Trevor said, Annie changed the joint tolerance. Marcus stared at him for several seconds. No, he said. Trevor's expression hardened. The log is clear. Marcus remembered Trevor asking to borrow his security badge the previous night. He had said he needed access to the tool cabinet near the demonstration controls. Marcus looked toward the window. Someone used her name. Annie returned to Mrs. Donnelly's apartment after sunset with her father's notebook, a borrowed laptop, and 3 photographs of the system log taken before security removed her from the plant. The television in the living room was tuned to local news. Her face appeared beneath a headline that read, Teen Engineer or Corporate Fraud. Mrs. Donnelly muted it before Annie could reach the remote. People on television get paid to sound certain before they know anything, she said. Eat first. A bowl of chicken soup waited on the kitchen table. Annie managed several spoonfuls, then opened the laptop. The alteration had been made at 9:41 that morning, 19 minutes before the final test. Her username appeared beside the change, but that did not prove she had entered it. Usernames could be copied, badges could be borrowed, passwords could be stolen. The question was not whose name appeared in the record. The question was how the false value had been entered. Annie enlarged the photograph until the digits blurred. Mrs. Donnelly placed a mug of tea beside her. "You've been staring at that same line for an hour. It doesn't belong there." "The number?" "The format." Annie pulled the original software manual from her bag. Ashcroft's bridge system had been built on a legacy engineering platform installed more than a decade earlier. The interface displayed pressure in pounds per square inch, unless a user manually changed the project settings. The altered tolerance appeared in megapascals. Annie checked the archive screenshots from earlier tests. Every legitimate entry used the older format. She sat upright. The person who changed the value had not used her workstation. The alteration had come through the newer administrative interface connected to the corporate network. That system converted values automatically before sending them into the old program. Whoever framed her understood how to steal her identity, but not how the original engineering platform recorded data. Annie called Marcus. He answered from the hospital. "I was about to call you. I found something." "So did I." She heard movement. Then the click of a door closing. "Trevor borrowed my security badge last night," Marcus said. "He told me the tool cabinet near the control station wouldn't recognize his card." "Did you give him your password?" "No. But my badge gets him through the outer door." Richard's administrator account could handle the rest. Annie explained the unit formatting error. Marcus was silent for several seconds. "That proves the change came through the corporate interface. It proves it didn't come from my terminal. And your archive account doesn't have remote access." "Exactly." Marcus exhaled. "I should have remembered the badge earlier. You were hit by a steel connector. I still gave it to him. Then tell Nathaniel." "I will." Annie closed her eyes. "He suspended me in front of everyone. He had federal inspectors, reporters, and half the board watching him. That's when decisions count." "I know." The next morning, Marcus signed a statement from his hospital bed. He described Trevor borrowing the badge, the time it happened, and the location of the control room. Linda Foster provided system records confirming Annie's archive account could not access the testing platform remotely. Nathaniel arrived at Mrs. Donnelly's building before 9. This time, he knocked and waited. Mrs. Donnelly opened the door but did not invite him in immediately. "Are you here as her employer, or as the man who embarrassed her on television?" Nathaniel looked tired. "Both, I suppose." "That is not a very good answer." "No, ma'am." She studied him, then stepped aside. Annie was seated at the kitchen table. Isaiah's ruler lay beside the laptop. Nathaniel removed his coat but remained standing. "Marcus gave us a statement," he said. "Linda confirmed your account limitations. Our outside security consultant reviewed the log format. And the alteration came through an administrative gateway. It could not have originated from your archive terminal." Annie waited. Nathaniel placed her badge on the table. "You were framed. I knew that yesterday." "Yes. You didn't act like it." Nathaniel pulled out the chair across from her. "I did not believe you sabotaged the bridge. You believed the company needed protection from me." He looked down at his hands. "I believed suspending you would give us time to control the situation." "Control whose situation?" "The board's, the federal review, the press. Not mine." "No." The admission came without defense. Nathaniel looked at her directly. "I questioned you because of your age. Other people dismissed you because of your race. We all found different words for the same failure." Annie felt Mrs. Donnelly pause in the hallway. Nathaniel continued. "I should have protected the integrity of the investigation instead of protecting the appearance of the company. An apology only matters if it changes what you do next." "I know." "Do you?" He nodded once. "Trevor's system access has been suspended. Richard's administrative accounts are frozen pending an independent audit. The board objected. I overruled them." "Richard agreed to that?" "No." That was the first useful answer Nathaniel had given. He opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. One was a copy of the corporate network map. Another showed access from Richard's office at 2:13 inches the morning, matching the record Annie had printed in the archive room. "You were right about the deleted project log," he said. "Someone from operations opened 3 of Daniel's files and erased the history." "Someone?" "The audit is tracing the individual credentials. Richard has had time to prepare." "Yes." Nathaniel did not soften the truth. Annie looked at the badge between them. "If I come back, I don't return as the girl you quietly reinstate after the cameras leave." "You won't." I want the suspension withdrawn in writing. Done. I want a public statement saying the evidence against me was false. The legal department drafted one this morning. I want Marcus's statement protected. Trevor will retaliate if he can. He won't have the authority. And I want access to the audit results concerning my father's files. Nathaniel hesitated. Annie leaned back. That pause is the same problem. He accepted the correction. You will have access. She picked up the badge but did not clip it on. What happens to the bridge? The federal officials suspended the demonstration program. We have 10 days to prove the failure was sabotage and show that the corrected design remains sound. And if we can't, the contract is gone, the plant closes. Mrs. Donnelly entered with a fresh pot of coffee. Then you two should stop arguing in my kitchen and get to work. Nathaniel almost smiled. His phone rang before either of them stood. He looked at the screen. Walter Hayes. Annie answered it on speaker. Walter's voice came through with a crackle. I found a machine that can play the cassette from Isaiah's locker. Does it work? Annie asked. It works. A PS followed. I listened to the first 30 seconds. Nathaniel's expression changed. Whose voice is on it? Walter answered quietly. Daniel's. Annie looked at Nathaniel. Walter continued. You both need to hear what he says, and you need to hear it somewhere Richard Cole cannot reach. Walter chose the old Union office because the building no longer connected to Ashcroft's internal network. It sat across from the factory behind a row of bare maple trees, with a faded sign above the entrance and a parking lot cracked by years of winter salt. Annie arrived with Nathaniel shortly after midnight. Marcus had signed himself out of the hospital against medical advice and was already inside, his right arm supported by a sling. June Hayes had brought coffee in a steel thermos and left 4 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper on the conference table. No one thinks clearly on an empty stomach, she said before going home. Walter locked the front door after them. The office had not changed much since the 1990s. Union photographs covered one wall. Retired workers smiled from company picnics, contract votes, and Labor Day parades. A framed list of men killed on the job hung beside an American flag. Isaiah Brooks's name appeared near the bottom. Annie looked at it for several seconds before sitting down. Walter placed an old cassette player in the center of the table. One speaker was held together with black electrical tape. The cassette from locker 117 rested beside it. I made a digital copy, Walter said. The original stays in a fireproof box from now on. Nathaniel pulled out a chair but did not sit. How much did you hear? Enough to know Daniel expected something to happen. The words made Nathaniel turn toward the dark window. Walter inserted the cassette and pressed play. Static filled the room. Then a chair scraped across a floor, followed by a man's tired breathing. Daniel Ashcroft's voice emerged from the speaker. Nate, this is Daniel. I don't know whether I'll give you this tape myself. If I don't, Walter Hayes has instructions. Nathaniel sat down. The voice continued. The bridge is not mine alone. Isaiah Brooks designed the emergency joint system and corrected the load transfer problem we had during the first prototype. His name belongs beside mine on every drawing, patent, and contract. Annie lowered her eyes to the black notebook. Daniel paused on the recording. Richard Cole opposed adding Isaiah to the project. He said the board would not accept a contract engineer as co-designer. That wasn't the real reason. He said investors needed a name they could trust. We both understood what he meant. Marcus shifted in his chair. Daniel's voice became quieter. I should have challenged him publicly. I didn't. I told Isaiah to wait until the design passed federal review. I thought recognition would be easier once the company needed him. I was wrong. Nathaniel closed his eyes. The tape clicked softly as it turned. Isaiah found falsified steel certificates tied to 2 federal projects. The material delivered was not the grade listed in procurement. Richard approved the purchase. Isaiah believed the substitution went higher than one office, but Richard was the person controlling the records. Walter stared at the list of dead workers on the wall. Isaiah was scheduled to meet a federal inspector on Tuesday morning. The crane failed before his shift ended on Monday. Maintenance records show the emergency brake was serviced 2 days earlier. The mechanic who signed the form says he never touched it. Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Daniel continued, I have copies of the procurement orders, the original brake inspection, and photographs of the modified control circuit. If something happens to me, start with Richard. Do not let the company investigate itself. Nathaniel opened his eyes. The next words struck harder. Nate, I called you because I need your help. I know we argued. I know you think I'm destroying the company over one contractor and a set of bad invoices. But this is not about one contractor. It is about what we become when we decide some people are easier to erase. The recording fell silent for several seconds. Nathaniel looked down at his hands. Annie watched him but said nothing. Daniel returned with one final message. If you hear this, do not protect the company from the truth. Protect the truth from the company. The tape ended with a mechanical click. No one moved. Outside, a freight train sounded near the lake, its horn carrying through the cold. Nathaniel was the first to speak. He called me 3 times the night before he died. Annie looked at him. I was in Chicago negotiating an acquisition, he continued. He left messages. I heard the first few seconds and decided we would speak after the deal closed. You never called him back? No. Nathaniel's voice remained controlled, but his face no longer did. The next morning, his car went through a barrier on Interstate 90. The police said the brakes failed. Marcus looked toward Walter. Was the car examined? Company lawyers handled everything, Walter said. By the time Daniel's friends started asking questions, the vehicle had been destroyed. Nathaniel stood and walked toward the wall of photographs. For 15 years, I told myself he had been reckless. He drove too fast. He worked too much. I made his death into something I could live with. Annie looked at Daniel's cassette. My father knew he was in danger. Walter nodded. He was trying to protect you. He should have told me. You were 14. That didn't stop the consequences from finding me. Walter did not answer. Annie looked at Nathaniel. Adults call it protection when they decide children cannot survive the truth. Then they leave us to survive what happens because of it. Nathaniel absorbed the words without looking away. You're right. Annie opened the envelope recovered from locker 117. Inside were copies of drawings, procurement forms, and a handwritten letter from Daniel. Nathaniel read it silently. What does it say? Marcus asked. Nathaniel handed the page to Annie. Daniel admitted he had delayed placing Isaiah's name on the design because he feared the board would cancel the project. He promised to correct the record after federal approval. He never got the chance. Annie folded the letter. He knew it was wrong. Yes, Nathaniel said, and he waited anyway. Yes. She looked at him. Then putting my father's name back is not enough. What else do you want? The deaths reopened. The workers told the truth. Every record released. No press conference where this company apologizes, puts my father's picture on a wall, and keeps the people responsible in their offices. Nathaniel nodded. Agreed. Richard will fight. I know. The board may remove you. I know that too. Annie studied him for a moment. This was not forgiveness. It was an agreement about what the truth would cost. Marcus's phone vibrated on the table. He checked the screen. The security audit found the access path used to frame Annie. Nathaniel took the phone. The administrator credentials belonged to Richard's office. The physical entry into the control room had been made with Marcus's borrowed badge. Trevor's badge had been used at a second door 6 minutes later. Nathaniel immediately called plant security. Find Trevor Pike. Do not approach Richard until I return. He listened, then his expression changed. What do you mean he's gone? Annie stood. The guard on the phone had searched Trevor's office, the engineering floor, and the employee lot. His car was missing. His company phone had been left inside his desk. Nathaniel ended the call. Walter looked toward the cassette player. Trevor helped Richard frame her. Marcus pushed himself up with his good arm. And now Richard knows the audit can prove it. Annie closed her father's notebook. Trevor isn't running because he feels guilty. Nathaniel met her eyes. No, he said. He's running because he finally understands he may be the next piece of evidence Richard needs to erase. Trevor called Annie at 6:12 the next morning from a payphone outside an abandoned strip mall on US Route 12. She almost ignored the unknown number. Don't hang up, he said. His voice was strained. I can prove Richard framed you. Annie sat upright on Mrs. Donnelly's sofa. Where are you? The Lakeview Diner. Back booth. Come alone. No. If Richard sees Nathaniel or plant security, I'm gone. You helped him sabotage the bridge. I know. You helped put Marcus in the hospital. I know that too. Then give the evidence to the police. Trevor went quiet. I tried, he said. Someone followed me from the plant. Annie looked through the blinds. Snow had begun to collect along the curb. Stay there. She called Nathaniel, Marcus, and Walter before leaving. Nathaniel wanted police sent immediately, but Annie argued that Trevor might run if he saw uniforms. They agreed Marcus would wait in a pickup truck across the road, while Nathaniel contacted a state investigator they could trust. The Lakeview diner had vinyl booths, a counter lined with chrome stools, and a handwritten sign advertising turkey pot pie for $8.99. Truck drivers drank coffee beneath a television showing the weather forecast. The waitress called Annie honey and pointed toward the back. Trevor sat alone with both hands around a cup he had not touched. He looked as though he had slept in his clothes. His tie was gone, his shirt collar was open, and a bruise darkened one side of his jaw. Annie slid into the opposite booth. "You have 5 minutes." Trevor glanced toward the window. "Richard told me the bridge project had to fail." "Why?" He said Nathaniel would never sell the plant while the federal contract was still possible. Great Lakes Urban Development wants the property. Richard gets a consulting position and a percentage after the sale. That explains the bridge. It doesn't explain my father. I didn't know anything about Isaiah Brooks until you brought out that notebook. Annie watched his face. "You expect me to believe that?" "No, but it's true." The waitress approached with a coffee pot. Trevor shook his head too quickly. Annie accepted a refill she did not need. They waited until the waitress walked away. Trevor leaned forward. "Richard had me clone your credentials. I used Marcus's badge to enter the test control area and Richard's administrator account to change the joint tolerance. You knew the model could hurt someone. I thought the connector would fail during the low-load sequence. Richard said the emergency system would stop the test. It hit Marcus. I saw. You stood there and blamed me." Trevor lowered his eyes. "Yes." Annie felt no satisfaction in his shame. "You didn't become innocent when you became afraid." "I'm not asking to." He reached inside his coat and placed a flash drive beneath a paper napkin. Emails, payment records, instructions from Richard, copies of the access logs before they were deleted. "Why keep copies?" "Because I never trusted him." "But you still worked for him." Trevor looked toward the counter. "He promised me Daniel's old position after the sale. Vice President of Engineering for the development group. You sold 1,800 jobs for a title." His mouth tightened. "I told myself the plant was dying anyway. That is what people say when they want the outcome without admitting they helped cause it." Trevor accepted the words. "There's more," he said. Richard moved the missing documents from Building C to Warehouse 9. "Where?" "Old company property near the West Rail Yard. It stores obsolete electrical equipment and archived paper records." "Why move them there?" "He's burning it tonight." Annie stopped. Trevor slid a folded site map across the table. "The fire starts at midnight. He has already disabled the alarms and arranged for an electrical fault to appear near the main storage room. Then call the fire department." "It isn't only the records." Annie waited. Richard ordered part of the night maintenance crew to inspect the old furnace line at 11:30. He wants them inside when the fire spreads. The diner sounds seemed to recede. "How many workers?" 30, maybe more. "He's planning to kill them?" "He wants the fire blamed on neglected equipment and worker error. Dead employees make the story cleaner." Annie stared at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I heard him talking about me." Trevor rubbed the bruise on his jaw. He said loose ends become liabilities. I realized he wasn't talking about the files. Outside, a dark SUV entered the parking lot. Trevor saw it first. His face changed. "We need to go." Annie looked through the window. The SUV stopped near the far edge of the lot. Its windows were tinted. Marcus's pickup remained across the road. Annie reached for her phone. Trevor stood. "Not here." They moved toward the side exit. The waitress called after them about the check, but Annie left cash on the counter without stopping. The wind outside carried snow across the pavement. Trevor walked quickly toward his sedan. "Give me the rest of the evidence," Annie said. "It's in the car." He reached the driver's door. An engine roared behind them. The dark SUV accelerated across the lot. "Trevor!" Annie shouted. He turned too late. The SUV struck him and threw him against the side of his sedan. Metal buckled. Trevor hit the pavement and did not move. The SUV continued through the far exit. Marcus drove across the road before it cleared the intersection, but the snow and traffic blocked his view within seconds. He abandoned the chase and ran toward Annie. She knelt beside Trevor. Blood spread beneath his head. His breathing came in shallow pulls. Marcus checked his pulse with his uninjured hand. "Call 911. Annie already had the phone out. Trevor's eyes opened. "The car," he whispered. "What about it?" "Trunk." Marcus took Trevor's keys and opened the sedan. Inside the trunk were 2 boxes of copied records, a laptop, and a red binder marked Emergency Shutdown Procedures. Trevor caught Annie's sleeve. "The fire," he said. "We know." "No, listen." His breathing faltered. "The fire isn't the cover-up." Annie leaned closer. "It's the deadline." His eyes closed. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. Paramedics stabilized Trevor and transported him to Street Mary Medical Center under police escort. Nathaniel reached the diner as investigators photographed the parking lot. Annie handed him the flash drive and the site map. He said 30 workers may still be inside the plant tonight. Nathaniel read the map. "I'll call the FBI. They may not get here in time. They'll have to." Marcus opened the red emergency binder. Several pages had been removed. One remaining diagram showed the factory's alarm network, gas lines, and old maintenance tunnels. Annie recognized the handwriting in the margins. Her father's. A storm warning sounded from the radio inside the diner. Heavy snow was expected by nightfall, and road conditions were already worsening. Nathaniel looked toward the factory chimneys in the distance. "We evacuate the plant now. Richard controls operations," Marcus said. "He'll deny the threat and move the workers before police arrive." Walter joined them carrying Daniel's cassette and the original documents from the union office. Nathaniel studied the people standing around him, an 18-year-old archive assistant, an injured engineer, and a retired union leader with a cane. Then he looked at Annie. "You understand the old plant layout better than anyone. My father's drawings show the maintenance tunnels. I'm not asking you to go inside. You don't have to." By late afternoon, snow covered the rail yard, and the first shift left Ashcroft Steel believing the plant would reopen as usual the next morning. Inside the operations building, Richard Cole shut down the alarm network one section at a time. At 11:23 that night, Annie stood at the entrance to an old service tunnel with Isaiah's notebook inside her coat and his brass key in her hand. Beyond the steel door, the factory that had killed her father waited in darkness. At 11:23, Nathaniel unlocked the service door with a master key that should have activated an alarm. Nothing happened. The tunnel beyond was narrow, damp, and lined with pipes wrapped in flaking insulation. Emergency lights glowed every 30 feet, leaving long sections in darkness. Snowmelt ran down the concrete steps behind them before Nathaniel pulled the door shut. Annie opened Isaiah's notebook beneath her flashlight. "He marked this passage as Utility Corridor B," she said. "It runs beneath Building C and comes up near the old furnace line." Marcus adjusted the sling supporting his injured shoulder. "How old are those drawings?" 17 years. Nathaniel looked at the rusted pipe above them. Comforting. Walter remained near the entrance with a handheld radio and a ring of old Union keys. His knee would not allow him to move quickly through the tunnels, so he had taken responsibility for contacting the night crew through a maintenance frequency the company stopped monitoring years ago. "I'll reach Earl and the shift stewards," Walter said. "If Richard still controls the main system, I'll use the welder's channel." Nathaniel handed him a phone. "State police have the location. The FBI office in Merrillville is sending agents, but the snow is slowing them down." Walter looked at Annie. "You find those workers first." She nodded. The 4 of them moved deeper into the tunnel. The factory sounded different from below. Pumps thudded behind concrete walls. Steam lines clicked as they cooled. Somewhere above, heavy machinery operated without the usual warning horns. Marcus stopped beneath a junction box. "The alarm circuit is dead. Can you restore it?" Nathaniel asked. "Not from here. I need the secondary control panel near the fabrication hall." Nathaniel looked at the passage ahead. "Then that's where we go." Annie studied the notebook. "Not this way." Nathaniel had already stepped toward the left corridor. She caught his sleeve. "That route passes under Conveyor 6. So, the support columns were marked for replacement before my father died." Nathaniel looked up at the ceiling as if he could see through 3 floors of concrete. "No one replaced them?" "The maintenance history says the work was postponed." Marcus checked his tablet. "She's right. The repair order was closed as deferred." Nathaniel stepped back. Annie pointed to the opposite passage. "We take the water service corridor. It adds 7 minutes." "You're leading," Nathaniel said. The words carried no ceremony. He simply moved behind her. They reached the lower level of the old furnace building at 11:41. The air was warmer there and smelled of oil, heated metal, and natural gas. A red emergency light flashed weakly above a stairwell, though no alarm sounded. Walter's voice came through the radio. I reached Earl. 32 maintenance workers are inside. Richard's office told them a storm inspection was mandatory. Where are they? Annie asked. Most are near Furnace 2. 6 are checking the west ventilation line. Marcus looked at the wall map. The west line is closest to Warehouse 9. Nathaniel raised the radio. Get all of them out. I'm trying. Their supervisor says the east loading doors are locked. Nathaniel's face hardened. Richard locked them inside. Annie moved toward the stairs. They found the main crew in a maintenance bay beneath Furnace 2. Earl Simmons stood beside a tool cart arguing with the night supervisor, who held a dead radio in one hand. When Earl saw Annie, relief crossed his face. Miss Brooks, somebody want to tell me why the doors won't open? There's a fire planned at Warehouse 9, Annie said. The alarm system has been disabled. We need everyone out now. The supervisor shook his head. Operations told us this was a routine inspection. Nathaniel Ashcroft is standing behind me, Annie replied. Ask him. The workers turned. Nathaniel stepped forward. The building is being evacuated. Leave your equipment. A low boom sounded from the west side of the plant. Dust fell from the rafters. Marcus looked toward the ceiling. That wasn't electrical. Orange light appeared through the upper windows. Warehouse 9 was burning. The crew moved toward the east loading bay, but a grinding sound stopped them. A roof support had shifted above the passage. One end of a steel crossbeam dropped across the exit, tearing cables from the wall. The workers backed away as sparks struck the floor. Earl looked at Nathaniel. That's our only clear route. There's a second door near the furnace controls, the supervisor said. Locked, one of the workers replied. We checked. Marcus examined the fallen beam. We can't cut through it. Heat will weaken the support above. Nathaniel pointed toward 2 hydraulic jacks near the tool cage. Can we lift it? Not from the center, Marcus said. The roof load will follow it down. Annie opened the notebook. Isaiah had drawn the bay during a renovation. The fallen beam carried part of the overhead maintenance rail, but the rail connected to 2 columns through adjustable brackets. She looked at the structure, then at the drawing. We don't lift the beam, she said. We transfer the roof load first. Marcus moved beside her. To where? The maintenance rail. That rail hasn't carried weight in years. It doesn't need to carry it for years, it needs to carry it for 90 seconds. She pointed to the jacks. 1 under each rail bracket. Raise them together until the roof load moves off the fallen beam. Then we lift the beam 3 inches at the west end. The supervisor frowned. 3 inches won't clear a person. No, but it will let us slide the tool carts underneath. The carts become temporary supports. Then we raise it again. Nathaniel looked at Marcus. Marcus studied the connections. The load path works. Do it, Nathaniel said. Earl called 6 workers forward. Annie gave each instruction slowly. No one interrupted her. 2 men positioned the jacks beneath the rail brackets. Marcus monitored the displacement while Annie watched the ceiling joints. 1/2 inch, she said. The jacks rose. Metal groaned above them. 1 inch. A bolt snapped somewhere near the furnace. The supervisor flinched. Keep going, Annie said. Slowly, at 1 3/4 inches, the fallen beam shifted. The load is transferring, Marcus said. They placed a 3rd jack beneath the west end and raised it just enough to slide 2 steel tool carts under the beam. Workers locked the wheels and stacked thick plates across the tops. Annie checked the gap. 1 at a time. Stay low. No bags, no tools. Earl went through first, then began guiding workers from the other side. Nathaniel remained beside Annie while the crew crawled beneath the supported beam. You should go, he told her. After them. You're 18. They're responsible for families too. He looked at her but did not argue again. The last worker cleared the beam at 11:58. Marcus followed, then Annie. Nathaniel came last. Seconds after he passed beneath it, 1 hydraulic jack slipped. The beam dropped onto the tool carts with a crash that flattened both of them. The temporary path was gone. They moved through the loading corridor toward the exterior doors. Walter had reached the control box from outside and released the old mechanical locks. Snow blew into the bay when the doors opened. Workers crossed the yard in groups, covering their faces against the wind. Walter counted each person as they reached the Union van. 32, he said. Everyone from Furnace, 2. Nathaniel looked toward Warehouse 9. Flames had reached the roof. The records are still in there. Annie watched fire move behind the windows. The proof of her father's work could be burning only 100 yards away. Nathaniel took one step toward the warehouse. Annie caught his arm. "No, that building contains Daniel's files. It also sits beside the main gas line. If those documents burn, my father died because this company valued paper, contracts, and money more than workers." Annie met his eyes. "We are not doing that again." Nathaniel looked at the evacuated crew, then at the warehouse. He lowered his hand. Marcus's tablet sounded an alert. He stared at the screen. "The main gas valve is open." Walter looked toward the furnace building. "Can it be shut remotely?" Richard disabled the controls. Another alarm appeared. Marcus turned the tablet so they could see it. Pressure was rising in the line running beneath Warehouse 9. "If the fire reaches that pipe," he said, "half the plant goes with it." Annie opened Isaiah's notebook to the utility diagram. The manual shutoff lay inside the factory, beyond the collapsed loading corridor, and the only remaining route ran through the old control wing, where Richard Cole was waiting. The wind drove snow across the loading yard as Annie studied the utility diagram in her father's notebook. The manual shutoff sat inside the old control wing, one level below the gas distribution room. The direct route from Furnace 2 was blocked by the collapsed beam, but Isaiah had marked a secondary passage through the electrical maintenance corridor. "It's here," Annie said, pointing to a narrow line on the page. "The corridor connects the fabrication hall to the control wing." Marcus looked at the tablet. "That section was sealed years ago, only at the main entrance. There's a service hatch behind the old compressor room." Nathaniel turned toward the evacuated workers. "Walter, keep everyone beyond the south fence. If the pressure rises another 10%, move them toward Broadway." Walter gripped the radio. "What about you?" "We shut down the gas." "You call the police again," Nathaniel added. "Tell them Richard Cole is still inside." Walter looked at Annie. "Your father drew that passage?" "He inspected it, then check it twice." Annie nodded. She, Nathaniel, and Marcus crossed the yard toward the fabrication hall. Earl tried to follow, but Annie stopped him. "You have 32 workers outside because you helped them move. Stay with them." Earl did not like it, but he understood. "Bring yourselves back out." Inside, emergency lighting cast the hall in red. Smoke had begun slipping through the ventilation system from Warehouse 9. The air tasted of dust and burned plastic. Marcus led them behind the old compressor units, where Annie found a square service hatch beneath a layer of insulation panels. The bolts were rusted. Nathaniel used a steel wrench as a lever until the first one broke loose. The passage beyond was less than 4 feet high. Marcus examined his injured shoulder. "I can crawl, but not fast." "You restore the communications system," Annie said. "The secondary panel is in the room above us." Nathaniel shook his head. "No one separates. We need Richard recorded if we find him. We also need the police to hear what is happening." Marcus understood before Nathaniel did. "She's right. If I bring the emergency network back online, every radio and loudspeaker in the plant becomes active." Nathaniel looked between them, then handed Marcus his phone. "Open a direct line to state police." Marcus climbed the narrow stairs toward the secondary panel, while Annie and Nathaniel entered the service passage. They crawled through dust and old cable fragments for almost 60 feet. The notebook showed 2 turns, but the second junction had partially collapsed. Annie had to squeeze between a steam pipe and a concrete support while Nathaniel pushed loose debris away from her legs. At the end, they reached a metal grate overlooking the control wing. Richard Cole stood below. He was alone beside the main console, wearing his overcoat and leather gloves. A black pistol rested on the desk within reach. 3 security monitors showed the fire moving across Warehouse 9 and workers gathering beyond the south fence. Richard looked at the pressure gauge and checked his watch. Annie understood then. He was not trying to escape yet. He was waiting for the explosion. Nathaniel removed the grate carefully, but the lower hinge squealed. Richard turned. He picked up the pistol. "Come down slowly," he said. Nathaniel climbed out first, placing himself between Richard and Annie. "It's over, Richard." Richard gave a tired smile. "You still think this is about one bridge. It's about 2 murders, fraud, sabotage, and 32 workers you locked inside a burning plant. They are outside now. No thanks to you." Richard gestured toward the monitors. "And in 10 minutes, none of the evidence will matter." Annie climbed down beside Nathaniel. Richard's eyes settled on the black notebook under her coat. You should have stayed in the archive room. You should have left my father's work alone. Your father did not understand business. He understood the steel you lied about. Richard's jaw tightened. Nathaniel took one step forward. Put the gun down. Richard raised it slightly. You inherited a company built by people willing to make decisions you never had the stomach to make. Plants survive because someone chooses which problems get solved and which people get replaced. My brother was a problem. Daniel was sentimental. He wanted to turn an engineering firm into a charity. And Isaiah? Richard looked at Annie. Useful, talented, but not suitable. For what? Annie asked. For the front page of a federal contract. For investor meetings. For the story the company needed to sell. You mean because he was black? Richard's expression barely changed. I mean because the board trusted an Ashcroft name. My father's name was on the design. For a short time, Nathaniel stared at him. You removed it. I protected the project. You killed him. Richard glanced toward the rising pressure gauge. Isaiah forced the issue. He intended to expose the steel substitution and destroy the contracts keeping this plant alive. So you altered the crane. I corrected a threat. Annie felt anger rise through her, but she kept her voice steady. And Daniel? Richard looked at Nathaniel. Your brother found the brake records. He wanted to go to the authorities. His car already had maintenance problems. I made certain they became final. Nathaniel moved toward him. Richard aimed the pistol at his chest. Don't. A faint click sounded from the ceiling speakers. Marcus's voice came through, distorted but clear. Emergency communications restored. Richard looked up. Annie saw the realization reach him. She said, You were right about one thing. They didn't believe me. The red light above the console came on, so I made sure they heard you. Richard lunged toward the controls. Nathaniel struck his gun arm aside. The shot shattered a monitor. Annie dropped behind the console as the two men crashed into the desk. Richard drove his shoulder into Nathaniel's chest and reached for the emergency panel. Nathaniel caught his wrist, but Richard kicked him backward and moved toward the broadcast switch. Annie saw the pistol on the floor. She did not reach for it. Instead, she pulled the main console drawer open and found the mechanical lock bar marked on Isaiah's diagram. She slammed it into place. Steel pins engaged inside the control cabinet. Richard hit the shutdown command. Nothing happened. What did you do? Locked the controls. He turned toward her. Nathaniel tackled him before he could move. They fell into the corridor. Richard struck Nathaniel across the face and ran for the west exit, leaving the pistol behind. Marcus's voice came over the loudspeaker again. State police heard the confession. Units are 3 minutes out. Nathaniel pushed himself upright, blood at the corner of his mouth. Let him run. Annie looked at the pressure gauge. It had entered the red zone. The gas line. Marcus appeared in the doorway, pale from pain. Remote shutdown is dead. The manual valve is in the service conduit beside furnace 3. Nathaniel checked Isaiah's notebook. The conduit was narrow and partially surrounded by fire. I'll go, he said. You won't fit, Annie replied. He looked at her injured wrist, then at the diagram. No, my father designed the emergency shutoff. You're 18, and the pipe doesn't care. Another warning sounded. Pressure climbed again. Annie took the steel ruler from her bag and placed it inside the notebook to mark the valve sequence. Nathaniel caught her arm. You don't have to prove anything else. This isn't about proving it. She met his eyes. It's about stopping what he started. Outside, sirens approached through the snow. Richard ran toward the main gate, where Walter, Earl, and the evacuated workers were waiting. Inside, Annie turned toward the furnace conduit as the first gas alarm finally began to scream. The gas alarm followed Annie down the corridor. Its broken metallic pulse bounced from the concrete walls as she ran toward furnace 3 with Nathaniel and Marcus behind her. Smoke had thickened near the ceiling, and the emergency lights flickered each time power shifted across the old plant. Marcus held Isaiah's notebook open with his good hand. The conduit entrance should be behind the pressure control cabinet, he said. They found the cabinet beside a row of insulated pipes. Nathaniel pulled the access panel free, revealing a passage barely wide enough for Annie's shoulders. Heat rolled out of it. Nathaniel looked inside, then at her. There has to be another way. There isn't. You could lose consciousness before you reach the valve. Annie took a damp shop cloth from an emergency station and tied it over her mouth. Then keep talking to me. Marcus handed her the notebook. She removed the steel ruler and gave the book back. If I drop the radio signal, Read the sequence aloud. Nathaniel caught her wrist before she entered. Annie. She looked at him. His face carried the fear he had tried to turn into authority since the first day they met. My father taught me how this system works, she said. Let me finish what he started. Nathaniel released her. Annie lowered herself into the conduit. The metal floor burned through her jeans. She crawled on her elbows, keeping the flashlight between her teeth. Pipes ran along both sides, some marked with labels that had faded until only fragments remained. Behind her, Marcus's voice came through the radio clipped to her collar. 20 feet to the first junction. I see it. The left line is the pressure bypass. Annie reached the junction and found 2 wheels. One was red, the other yellow. Heat had blistered the paint. The diagram says open the bypass halfway, Marcus said. Do not close the primary valve first. Annie wrapped the steel ruler through the spokes of the yellow wheel for leverage. The valve resisted. She pulled harder. Nothing moved. Nathaniel, she said into the radio. Pressure reading, still rising. How long? Marcus answered. Maybe 4 minutes before the line reaches ignition risk. Annie adjusted the ruler and braced one boot against the conduit wall. The wheel shifted with a grinding sound. 1/4 turn, she said. Keep going, Marcus replied. Half turn total. The valve opened. A deep vibration moved through the pipe beneath her. Outside the conduit, Nathaniel watched the pressure gauge drop slightly, then stop. Bypass is active, Marcus said. Now move 15 feet forward to the relief line. Annie crawled deeper. Smoke entered through a damaged seam ahead. Her eyes watered, and every breath through the cloth tasted of metal. She reached the relief wheel. This one had warped from heat. The wheel is bent. Can it move? Marcus asked. Not by hand. Nathaniel's voice cut in. Come back. No. Annie, the pressure is not worth your life. 32 people are outside that fence. There are homes across Broadway. She slid the steel ruler behind the warped wheel and pressed down. The ruler bent. For one terrible second, Annie thought it would break. Then the valve moved. A burst of steam escaped from a fitting near her face. She turned away, but the heat struck the side of her neck. She cried out. Nathaniel moved toward the conduit opening. Annie, I'm still here. Her voice shook now. She repositioned the ruler and forced the wheel another turn. Relief line open, she said. Marcus watched the gauge. Pressure is dropping. Now close the primary valve slowly. If you close it too fast, the housing may fracture. The primary valve stood another 10 feet ahead. Annie crawled toward it, each movement slower than the last. The gas alarm had become distant beneath the sound of blood in her ears. She reached the final wheel. It was larger than the others and secured by a locking pin. The pin would not release. She looked at the steel ruler. A narrow notch near one end matched the old mechanical latch. Her father had not given her an ordinary ruler. He had carried an emergency maintenance tool disguised as one. Annie fitted the notch over the pin and twisted. The lock released. She placed both hands on the wheel and began turning it. Outside, the pressure gauge fell steadily. Quarter closed, Marcus said. Annie turned again. Half. The conduit shook. Dust fell around her. Nathaniel looked toward the furnace roof. Something is moving. Marcus saw the structural alarm appear on the tablet. The support frame above the conduit is failing. Nathaniel grabbed the radio. Annie, close it and get out now. She forced the wheel through the final turn. The gas line stopped. For 1 second, everything became quiet. Then the frame collapsed. The impact threw Annie against the conduit wall. A support brace crashed across her right leg, pinning her below the knee. Her flashlight rolled into the darkness. Annie? Nathaniel's voice came through the radio. She tried to move. Pain tore through her leg. I'm trapped. Nathaniel entered the conduit before Marcus could stop him. His shoulders scraped both walls as he crawled toward her. Smoke made him cough, but he continued until he reached the fallen brace. I told you I wouldn't fit, he said through strained breath. Annie almost laughed, but the pain stopped her. You were right. Nathaniel tried lifting the brace. It did not move. Don't pull from the center, Annie said. It's on your leg, and part of the roof load is on it. Lift the wrong point and more comes down. She searched the floor with one hand until she found the ruler. Place it under the left edge. There's a support plate beneath the pipe. Nathaniel wedged the ruler into the gap. It will bend. It already did. He pressed down. The brace rose less than an inch. Annie pulled her leg free, but another section of conduit collapsed behind Nathaniel. A steel fragment struck his shoulder and knocked him sideways. "Nathaniel, I'm fine." He was not. Blood spread beneath his torn sleeve. They crawled back together, Annie dragging her injured leg while Nathaniel pushed loose debris away from her path. Marcus reached through the opening and pulled Annie out first, then helped Nathaniel into the corridor. The pressure gauge had fallen to 0. A muffled explosion rolled through Warehouse 9, but the gas line did not ignite. Windows shattered across the rail yard. Flames climbed through the roof and stopped there. Outside the main gate, Richard reached his car and found Walter standing in front of it. Earl and more than 30 workers formed a line behind the old union leader. "Move," Richard said. Walter rested both hands on his cane. "We moved for men like you our whole lives," he replied. "Tonight you wait." Richard turned toward the side gate, but state police vehicles entered through it with lights flashing. Officers ordered him to the ground. He looked back at the workers as handcuffs closed around his wrists. No one stepped aside. Paramedics carried Annie and Nathaniel into the yard. Snow fell through the orange light from the burning warehouse. Annie watched the roof collapse. "The records," she said. Nathaniel followed her gaze. "Gone." Walter approached the stretcher carrying a sealed metal document case. "Not all of them." He placed it beside Annie. Isaiah made a second set. He left it in the union safe deposit box. "I was too afraid to open it for 14 years. Annie released the latches. Inside lay the original bridge calculations, the safety report, photographs of the altered crane circuit, and a title sheet protected beneath wax paper. 2 names were typed across the bottom: Daniel Ashcroft, Isaiah Brooks. Annie touched her father's name. For years, every record had described Isaiah as a contractor who died in an accident. Now she held proof that he had been an engineer, a designer, and a man who had told the truth when others found silence more convenient. The factory fire burned behind her, but the paper in her hands remained untouched. For the first time, Annie was not holding evidence of what had been taken from her father. She was holding the beginning of what would be returned. By dawn, the fire was under control. Warehouse 9 was gone, along with the records Richard had moved there. But the document case Walter recovered survived. So did the recording from the control room, the access logs Trevor copied, and the testimony of 32 workers who had heard Richard's confession over the factory loudspeakers. Annie spent 2 days at Street Mary Medical Center. Her leg was badly bruised but not broken. The burn on her neck required treatment, and doctors ordered her to stay off the injured leg for several weeks. Nathaniel's shoulder had been fractured by falling steel. He remained in the room across the hall and argued with every nurse who told him to rest. Marcus visited them wearing his sling. "You two look terrible," he said. Annie glanced at his bandaged shoulder. "You look qualified to judge." Walter arrived behind him carrying coffee and a paper bag from a bakery near Broadway. June had sent cinnamon rolls and a handwritten note instructing everyone to eat before discussing lawyers, police, or revenge. Nathaniel unfolded the note with his good hand. "Does she always give orders like this?" Walter sat down. "Only when she thinks people might ignore common sense." State investigators questioned Annie that afternoon. Federal agents arrived before sunset. They collected Isaiah's original reports, Daniel's recording, Richard's confession, and the recovered project files. The investigation expanded within days. Richard Cole was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, destruction of evidence, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The deaths of Isaiah Brooks and Daniel Ashcroft were formally reopened. Trevor survived the attack in the diner parking lot. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital before giving a full statement to prosecutors. His cooperation reduced the charges he faced, but it did not erase them. He admitted sabotaging the bridge model, stealing Annie's credentials, removing documents from locker 117, and helping Richard hide the access records. When a reporter asked whether Trevor had become a hero for turning against Richard, Annie answered without hesitation, "No. He became a witness. Those are not the same thing." The sentence appeared in newspapers across the country. Ashcroft Industries entered the worst crisis in its history. Federal contracts were frozen. The stock price fell. Several board members resigned after investigators uncovered years of falsified procurement records and safety reports. The board demanded Nathaniel keep the findings private until the company could prepare a legal defense. He refused. 3 weeks after the fire, he stood before employees, reporters, and the families of workers killed at Ashcroft facilities. His injured arm remained in a brace. He did not blame Richard alone. This company created the conditions that allowed him to act, Nathaniel said. We rewarded silence. We treated reputation as more valuable than evidence. My family benefited when Isaiah Brooks's name was removed from work he helped create. I questioned his daughter because she did not look like the experts I expected to trust. Annie watched from the first row beside Walter, Marcus, and June. Nathaniel continued, a company that survives by stealing a man's name and silencing his daughter does not deserve to survive unchanged. The board voted to remove him that afternoon. The vote failed by 1 seat after employee pension representatives and several independent directors supported him. Nathaniel remained chairman, but Ashcroft Industries was placed under outside compliance supervision. Worker safety decisions could no longer be overruled by operations management, and the union received independent access to inspection records. The correction of Isaiah's name took longer. Lawyers argued over patents, employment classifications, and ownership rights. The company's old files described him as a temporary contractor. Daniel's recording described him as a partner. Isaiah's notebook and original calculations proved his technical role. 4 months after the fire, the United States Patent and Trademark Office accepted an amended filing. The modular bridge design officially listed 2 inventors, Daniel Ashcroft, Isaiah Brooks. Annie held the corrected document in Nathaniel's office. For several seconds, she said nothing. Nathaniel stood by the window overlooking the factory yard, where crews were repairing the damaged buildings. Is it enough? He asked. No. He turned. But it is true, she said. That matters. A memorial was installed in the main lobby. Annie rejected the first version because it described Isaiah only as a worker killed in an accident. The final plaque read, Isaiah Brooks, Army Corps structural engineer, co-designer, safety whistleblower, father and teacher. Below it was Daniel's name and a line from his recording, protect the truth from the company. Nathaniel offered Annie a senior engineering position. She stared at him. I'm 18. I am aware. I don't have a degree. You have done work some licensed engineers failed to do. That still doesn't make me licensed. Nathaniel nodded. What would be fair? Annie had already considered the answer. A full scholarship to Purdue University. Paid work during breaks. Independent mentors who did not report to Trevor's old department. Formal credit for restoring the design. A place on the Worker Safety Foundation established from the legal settlement. Nathaniel agreed. A degree will teach you what you do not know, he said. It cannot erase what you already proved. On Thanksgiving, June haze filled Walter's dining room with more people than the table could hold. Folding chairs came from the union office. Plates covered every counter. There was roast turkey, cornbread dressing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, sweet potatoes, pecan pie, and enough coffee for a night shift. Marcus brought his mother. Earl came with his wife. Mrs. Donnelly arrived carrying cranberry sauce and complained that everyone else had used too much sugar. Nathaniel stood near the sink drying plates. June handed him another one. You're a billionaire, Marcus said. You've never done dishes? Nathaniel examined the towel. Not under supervision. June pointed toward the rack. Money does not excuse a man from drying plates. For the first time, Annie heard Nathaniel laugh without restraint. Later, Walter sat beside her on the porch while the others talked inside. I signed the report that helped bury your father's case, he said. I cannot undo that. No, I should have spoken. Yes. Walter looked at the dark street. Annie did not offer easy forgiveness. You cannot change the day you stayed quiet, she said. You can decide what your voice costs from now on. He nodded. 1 year later, the first Brooks-Ashcroft modular bridge opened in a Kentucky town where flooding had destroyed the only reliable road to the county hospital. The ceremony was small. Local families stood beside firefighters, veterans, factory workers, and school children. The bridge crossed a muddy river beneath a cold blue sky. A brass plaque at the entrance read, designed by Daniel Ashcroft and Isaiah Brooks, restored by Annie Brooks, built for every community that deserves a way forward. Nathaniel stood beside Annie as the first school bus crossed. What would your father say? He asked. Annie watched the steel joints carry the weight from one support to the next. He'd tell me to check the load one more time. Nathaniel smiled. 3 years later, Annie returned to Gary during her university break. The old archive room had been transformed into an engineering classroom for local students. The filing cabinets were gone. Work tables stood beneath bright windows, covered with rulers, model bridges, and graph paper. A 12-year-old black girl studied a structural drawing. "Do you have to be a genius to understand these?" she asked. Annie sat beside her and placed Isaiah's steel ruler on the table. "No," she said. "You just need someone who believes you belong in the room." Outside, the factory was operating again. Some walls still carried stains from the fire, and not every loss had been repaired. Justice had not returned the years Isaiah lost or the calls Nathaniel never answered. It had done something smaller and more difficult. It had returned the truth to the record, the names to the design, and the future to a girl everyone had once mistaken for someone who should remain silent. The story teaches us that talent, dignity, and truth are not determined by age, race, education, or job title. Annie was ignored because she was young, black, and worked in the archive room, yet she saw what highly paid experts had missed. It also reminds us that silence can protect injustice just as surely as a lie. Real justice is not only about punishing the guilty, it is about restoring the names, voices, and dignity of those who were pushed aside, and making sure the next generation is given a fair chance to be heard. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.